So I titled this talk, The Politics of Cultural Despair, and that comes from a book by the scholar Fritz Stern, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, fled when he was 18, and then taught at Columbia University, and focused on the roots of fascism. What is it that propels a society or deforms a society to become fascist? And he targeted this quality of despair, which Hannah Arendt also does in The Origins of Totalitarianism, as do many great scholars of fascism. And so I take that title and use it as a kind of lens to look at the despair that is gripping the United States. The moral and physical decay of the United States and the malaise, what the French sociologist Émile Durkheim called anomie, has spawned predictable results. We have seen in varying forms the consequences of social and political collapse. During the twilight of the Greek and Roman empires, the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, Tsarist Russia, Weimar Germany, and the former Yugoslavia. There are voices from the past, Aristotle, Cicero, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Joseph Roth, and Milovan Djilas, who warned us. But trapped in a labyrinth of horror and blinded by our hubris and self-delusion, as if we are somehow exempt from human experience and human nature, we refuse to face the stark reality before us. Hundreds of thousands of Americans die each year from opioid overdoses, alcoholism, and suicide, what sociologists call deaths of despair. This despair fuels high rates of obesity, some 40% of the public, gambling, addictions, the pornification of the society, with the ubiquitous images of sexual sadism, along with the proliferation of armed right-wing militias and nihilistic mass shootings. Those overwhelmed by despair seek magical solutions, whether in crisis cults such as the Christian right, or demagogues such as Donald Trump, or hate-filled militias that see violence as a cleansing agent. As long as these dark pathologies are allowed to fester and grow, and the Democratic Party has made it clear it will not enact the kinds of radical social reforms that will curb these pathologies, the United States will continue its march towards disintegration. These diseases of despair, which were the focus of my last book, America, the Farewell Tour, will become more pronounced as the economic fallout from the pandemic drives larger and larger numbers of people into crisis. An estimated 300,000 Americans will be dead from the pandemic in December, a figure that is expected to rise to 400,000 in January. Chronic underemployment and unemployment, probably close to 20% when those who have stopped looking for work, those furloughed with no prospect of being rehired, and those who work part-time but are still below the poverty line are included in the official statistics instead of being magically erased from the unemployment rolls. Our privatized healthcare system, which is making record profits during the pandemic, is not designed to cope with a public health emergency. It did not stockpile the ventilators, masks, tests, and drugs to deal with COVID-19. It has steadily reduced the numbers of hospital beds. 48% of frontline workers remain today ineligible for sick pay. Some 43 million Americans have lost their employee-sponsored health insurance. Food banks are overrun with tens of thousands of desperate families. Roughly 10 to 14 million renter households, or 23 to 24 million people, were behind on their rent in September. That amounts to $12 to $17 billion in unpaid rent. And that figure is expected to rise to $34 billion in past due rent by January. The lifting of the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures will mean that millions of families, many destitute, will be tossed into the street. Hunger in US households almost tripled between 2019 and August of this year, according to the Census Bureau and the Department of Agriculture. The proportion of American children who do not have enough to eat, this same study found, is 14 times higher than it was last year. And this crisis accompanies the ecological crisis. There has been a 60% rise in global CO2 emissions since 1990. And all our marches, petitions, lobbying, appeals to the United Nations or the work of NGOs have made no difference. Our failure to cope with the greatest existential threat to the human species and most other species is matched by our failure to influence governing systems that have been captured by corporate power. The Democratic donor class made it abundantly clear, should Bernie Sanders have miraculously become the party's presidential nominee, they would join forces with the Republicans to crush him. The oligarchs preach the sermon of the least worst to us when they attempt to ram a Hillary Clinton or a Joe Biden down our throats, but ignore it for themselves. They prefer Biden over Trump, but they can live with either. Biden is a shallow political hack, devoid of fixed beliefs or intellectual or moral depth. He is an expression of the nostalgia of a ruling class that yearns to return to the pantomime of democracy. The ruling elites want to restore the decorum and civic religion that makes the presidency a form of monarchy and sacralizes the organs of state power. Trump's vulgarity and ineptitude are an embarrassment to the architects of empire. Only one thing matters to the corporate state. It is not democracy. It is not truth. It is not the consent of the governed. It is not income inequality. It is not the surveillance state. It is not endless war. It is not jobs. It is not the climate crisis. It is the primacy of corporate power, which has extinguished our democracy, taken from us our most basic civil liberties, and left most of the working class and working poor in misery. The corporate state seeks only the increase and consolidation of their wealth and power. Trump and Biden, doddering into old age with cognitive lapses and no moral cores, represent two sides of the same coin. Is Trump more dangerous than Biden? Yes. Is Trump inepter and more dishonest? Yes. Is Trump more of a threat to the open society? Yes. But is Biden the solution? No. Biden cannot plausibly offer change. He can only offer more of the same. And most Americans do not want more of the same. The country's largest voting age bloc, the 100 million plus citizens who out of apathy and disgust do not vote, will once again stay home. And this demoralization of the electorate is by design. Biden will only further fertilize the ground for an American fascism. In America, we are only permitted to vote against what we hate. Partisan media outlets set one group against another, a consumer version of what George Orwell in his novel 1984 called the 2 minutes of hate. Our opinions and prejudices are skillfully catered to and reinforced with the aid of a detailed digital analysis of our proclivities and habits, and then sold back to us. The result, as Matt Taibbi writes, is packaged anger just for you. The public is unable to speak across the manufactured divide. It is mesmerized by the fake descent of the culture wars and competing conspiracy theories. Politics under the assault is atrophied into a tawdry reality show centered on manufactured political personalities. Civil discourse has been poisoned by invective and lies. Power, meanwhile, is left unexamined and unchallenged. Political coverage is modeled, as Taibbi points out, on sports coverage. The sets look like the sets on Sunday NFL Countdown. The anchor is on one side. There are 4 commentators, 2 from each team. Graphics keep us updated on the score. Political identities are reduced to easily digestible stereotypes. Tactics, strategy, image, monthly campaign contributions, and polling are endlessly examined, while real political issues are ignored. This coverage masks the fact that on nearly all the major issues, the two ruling political parties are in complete agreement. The deregulation of the financial industry, trade agreements, the militarization of police, the explosion in the prison population, deindustrialization, austerity, support for fracking and the fossil fuel industry, the endless wars in the Middle East, the bloated military budget, the control of elections and mass media by corporations, and the wholesale government surveillance of the population. And when the government watches you 24 hours a day, you cannot use the word liberty. This is the relationship of a master and a slave. All have bipartisan support. And for this reason, these issues are almost never discussed. The goal is to set demographic against demographic, to blunt investigations into the machinery of power. This stoking of antagonisms is not news. It is entertainment, driven not by journalism, but marketing strategies to increase viewership and corporate sponsors. News divisions are revenue streams, competing against other revenue streams. The template for news, as Taibbi writes in his book Hate, Inc., the cover of which has Sean Hannity on one side and Rachel Maddow on the other, is the simplified morality play used in professional wrestling. There are only two real political positions in the United States. You love Trump or you hate him, which sums up the emotions of wrestling fans. But by voting for Biden and the Democrats, you are voting for something. You vote to endorse the humiliation of courageous women, such as Anita Hill, who confronted their abusers. You vote for the architects of the endless wars in the Middle East. You vote for the apartheid state in Israel. You vote for the wholesale surveillance of the public by government intelligence agencies and the abolition of due process and habeas corpus. You vote for austerity programs, including the destruction of welfare and cuts to Social Security. You vote for NAFTA, free trade deals, deindustrialization, a real decline in wages, the loss of hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs, and the offshoring of these jobs to underpaid workers who toil in sweatshops in Mexico, China, or Vietnam. You vote for the assault on public education and the transfer of federal funds to for-profit and Christian charter schools. You vote for the doubling of our prison population, the tripling and quadrupling of sentences, and huge expansion of crimes meriting the death penalty. You vote for militarized police who gun down poor people of color with impunity. You vote against the Green New Deal and immigration reform. You vote for the fracking industry. You vote for a segregated public school system in which the wealthy receive educational opportunities and the poor are denied a chance. You vote for punitive levels of student debt and the inability to free yourself of those debt obligations, even if you declare bankruptcy. You vote for deregulating the banking industry and the abolition of Glass-Steagall. You vote for the for-profit insurance and pharmaceutical corporations and against universal health care. You vote for defense budgets that consume more than half of all discretionary spending. You vote for the use of unlimited oligarchic and corporate money to buy our elections. And you vote for a politician, Joe Biden, who during his time in the Senate abjectly served the interests of MBNA, the largest independent credit card company in the United States, headquartered in Delaware, which also employed Biden's son, Hunter. Biden was one of the principal architects of the wars in the Middle East, where we have squandered upwards of $7 trillion and destroyed or extinguished the lives of millions of people. There are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, 24% of the world's population, and we have turned virtually all of them into our enemies. Biden is responsible for far more suffering and death at home and abroad than Trump. And if we had a functioning judicial and legislative system, Biden, along with the other architects of our disastrous imperial wars, the plundering of the country by corporate power, the betrayal of the working class, would be put on trial, not offered up as a solution to our political and economic debacle. The Democrats and their liberal apologists adopt tolerant positions on issues regarding race, religion, immigration, women's rights, and sexual identity, and pretend this is politics. But these issues are societal or ethical issues. Yes, they are important, but they are not social or political issues. The seizure of our economy by a class of global speculators and corporations has in fact devastated the very groups the Democratic Party pretends to lift up. When Bill Clinton, for example, destroyed the old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. Those on the right of the political spectrum, and we must never forget that the positions of the Democratic Party would make it a far-right party in Europe, demonize those on the margins of society as scapegoats. The culture wars mask the reality. Both ruling parties are full partners in the destruction of our democratic institutions. Both ruling parties have reconfigured American society into a mafia state. It only depends on how you want it dressed up. The power of politicians such as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, or Mitch McConnell comes from being able to funnel corporate money to anointed candidates. In a functioning political system, one not saturated with corporate cash, they would not hold power. They have transformed what the Roman philosopher Cicero called a commonwealth, a res publica, a public thing or the property of the people, into an instrument of pillage and repression on behalf of a global corporate oligarchy. We are serfs ruled by the obscenely rich, omnipotent masters who loot the US Treasury, pay little or no taxes, and have perverted the judiciary, the media, and the legislative branches of government to strip us of civil liberties and give them the freedom to commit financial fraud and theft. In the midst of the pandemic crisis, what did our ruling kleptocrats do? They looted $4 trillion on a scale unseen since the 2008 bailout, overseen by Barack Obama and Joe Biden. They gorged and enriched themselves at our expense, while tossing crumbs out of the windows of their private jets, yachts, and palatial estates to the suffering and despised masses. The CARES Act handed trillions in funds or tax breaks to oil companies, the airline industry, which alone got $50 billion in stimulus money, the cruise ship industry. It gave $170 billion windfall to the real estate industry, private equity firms, lobbying groups whose political action committees have given almost $200 million in campaign contributions to politicians in the last 2 decades, along with the meat industry and corporations that have moved offshore to avoid US taxes. The act allowed the largest corporations to gobble up money that was supposed to go to keep small businesses solvent, to pay workers. It gave 80% of tax breaks to millionaires and allowed the wealthiest to get stimulus checks that averaged $1.7 million. The CARES Act also authorized $454 billion for the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilization Fund, a massive slush fund doled out by Trump cronies to corporations that, when leveraged 10 to 1, can be used to create a staggering $4.5 trillion in assets. The act authorized the Fed to give $1.5 trillion in loans to Wall Street, which no one expects to be repaid. American billionaires have gotten $700 billion richer since the pandemic. And Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, whose corporation Amazon paid no federal taxes last year, alone added nearly $72 billion to his personal wealth since the pandemic began. During this same period, 55 million Americans have lost their jobs. The molding of the public into warring factions works commercially. It works politically. It destroys, as it is designed to do, class solidarity. But it is a recipe for social disintegration. I watched competing ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia retreat into antagonistic tribes. They seized rival media outlets and used them to spew vitriol and hate against the ethnicities they demonized. The poisonous images and rhetoric that were pumped out month after month in Yugoslavia eventually led to a savage fratricide. Those of us who covered the war in the former Yugoslavia see disturbing parallels in the disintegration of the United States. The United States is already plagued by an epidemic of mass shootings. There are death threats against critics of Trump, including Representative Ilhan Omar. There was an aborted plot by 13 members of a right-wing militia group to kidnap the governor of Michigan and storm the state capitol to start a civil war. A Trump supporter mailed pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and CNN, an effort to decapitate the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, as well as terrorize the media outlet that is the party's principal propaganda platform. The spark that usually sets such tinder ablaze is martyrdom. Aaron J. Danielson, a supporter of the right-wing group Patriot Prayer, was wearing a loaded Glock pistol in a holster and had bear spray and an expandable metal baton when he was shot dead on August 29th, allegedly by Michael Forrest Reinhold, a supporter of Antifa, in the streets of Portland. A woman in the crowd can be heard shouting after the shooting, "I'm not sad that an effing fascist died tonight." Reinhold, allegedly armed with a handgun, was ambushed and killed by federal agents in Washington state, an extrajudicial assassination that was common in countries such as Argentina and El Salvador when I covered the military regimes there. Once people start being sacrificed for the cause, it takes little for demagogues to insist that self-preservation necessitates violence. If we do not reintegrate those who have been pushed aside back into society, to heal ruptured social bonds, to give workers dignity, empowerment, and protection, if we do not build a universal healthcare system, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic spirals out of control, where families are not forced to bankrupt themselves to pay for medical costs, if we do not provide stable employment, sustainable wages, job protection, and pensions, if we do not give a quality public education to all Americans, if we do not rebuild our infrastructure and end the squandering of our resources on war, if we do not halt corporate pillage and regulate Wall Street and corporations, if we do not respond with radical and immediate measures to curb carbon emissions and save ourselves from ecocide and extinction, we will ensure the rise of a Christian fascism. Political stagnation and corruption, along with economic and social misery, spawn what anthropologists call crisis cults, movements led by demagogues that prey on an unbearable psychological and financial distress, that champion violence as a form of purification. These crisis cults, already well established among followers of the Christian right, right-wing militia groups, and many of those who follow Donald Trump, who see him not as a politician, but as a cult leader, peddle magical thinking, an infantilism that promises, if you surrender all autonomy, the road to prosperity, restored national glory, a return to a mythical past, order, and security. Trump is a symptom. He is not the disease. And if he leaves office, far more competent and dangerous demagogues will rise if the social conditions are not improved to take his place. I come out of the liberal Christian church. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. And I believe the greatest moral failing of the liberal church has been its refusal, justified in the name of tolerance and dialogue, to denounce the followers of the Christian right as heretics. By tolerating the intolerant, it ceded religious legitimacy to an array of con artists, charlatans, and demagogues and their cultish supporters. It stood by as the core gospel message, concern for the poor and oppressed, was perverted into a magical world where God and Jesus showered believers with material wealth and power. The white race became God's chosen agent. Imperialism and war became divine instruments for purging the world of infidels and barbarians, evil itself. Capitalism, because God blessed the righteous with wealth and power and condemned the immoral to poverty and suffering, became shorn of its inherent cruelty and exploitation. The iconography and symbols of American nationalism became intertwined with the iconography and symbols of the Christian faith. The mega pastors, narcissists who rule despotic, cult-like fiefdoms, make millions of dollars by using this heretical belief system to prey on the despair and desperation of their congregations, victims of neoliberalism and deindustrialization. These believers find in Trump and these megapastors a reflection of themselves, a champion of unfettered greed, the cult of masculinity, the lust for violence, white supremacy, bigotry, American chauvinism, religious intolerance, anger, racism, and conspiracy theories, which are the core central beliefs of the Christian right. When I wrote American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War on America, I was deadly serious about the term fascists. Tens of millions of Americans live hermetically sealed inside the vast media and educational edifice controlled by this crisis cult. In this world, miracles are real. Satan, allied with secular humanists and Muslims, is seeking to destroy America, and Trump is God's anointed vessel to build the Christian nation and cement into place a government that instills quote unquote biblical values. These biblical values include banning abortion, protecting the traditional family, turning the 10 Commandments into secular law, crushing infidels, especially Muslims, indoctrinating children in schools with biblical teachings, and thwarting sexual license, which includes any sexual relationship other than a marriage between a man and a woman. Trump is routinely compared by these evangelical leaders to the biblical King Cyrus, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and restored the Jews to the city. Trump, in fact, has filled his own ideological void with Christian fascism. He has elevated members of the Christian right to prominent positions, including Mike Pence to the vice presidency, Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, Ben Carson as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Bill Barr as Attorney General, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and Amy Coney Barrett's about to join them, and the televangelist Paula White to his Faith and Opportunities Initiative. More importantly, Trump has handed the Christian right veto and appointment power over key positions in government, especially in federal courts. He has installed 133 district court judges out of 677 total, 50 appeals court judges out of 179, and 2, and very soon 3, U.S. Supreme Court justices out of 9. This is 19% of the federal trial judges currently in service. Nearly all are extremists who make up these judicial appointees and have been rated as unqualified by the American Bar Association, the country's largest nonpartisan coalition of lawyers. Trump has moved to ban Muslim immigrants and roll back civil rights legislation. He has made war on reproductive rights by restricting abortion and defunding Planned Parenthood. He has stripped away LGBTQ rights. He has ripped down the firewall between church and state by revoking the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches which are tax exempt from endorsing political candidates. His appointees throughout the government routinely use biblical strictures to justify an array of policy decisions, including environmental deregulation, war, tax cuts, and the replacement of public schools with charter schools, an action that permits the transfer of federal funds to private Christian schools. I studied ethics when I was at Harvard Divinity School with James Luther Adams, who had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936. Adams witnessed the rise of the so-called German Christian Church, which was pro-Nazi. He warned us about the disturbing parallels between the German Christian Church and the Christian right. Adolf Hitler, in the eyes of the German Christian Church, was a Volk Messiah, an instrument of God, a view similar to the one held today about Trump by many of his white evangelical supporters. Those demonized for Germany's economic collapse, especially Jews and communists, were agents of Satan. Fascism, Adams told us, always cloaked itself in a nation's most cherished symbols and rhetoric. And fascism would come to America not in the guise of stiff-armed marching brown shirts and Nazi swastikas, but in mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance, the biblical sanctification of the state, and the sacralization of American militarism. Adams was the first person I heard label the extremists of the Christian right as fascists. And liberals, he warned, as in Nazi Germany, were blind to the tragic dimensions of history and radical evil. They would not react until it was too late. Trump's real legacy, I fear, will be the empowerment of these Christian fascists. They are what comes next. Noam Chomsky, for this reason, is right when he calls Mike Pence more dangerous than Trump. For decades, they have been organizing to take power. They have built infrastructures and organizations, including lobbying groups, schools, and universities, as well as media platforms to prepare. They have seeded their cadre into the judicial and legislative system, while we on the left have seen our institutions and organizations destroyed or corrupted by corporate power. Christian fascism is an emotional life raft for tens of millions of Americans. It is impervious to the education, dialogue, and discourse the liberal class naively believes can blunt or domesticate the movement. The Christian fascists, by choice, have severed themselves from rational thought. We will not placate or disarm this movement bent on our destruction by attempting to claim that we too have Christian values. This appeal only strengthens the legitimacy of the Christian fascists and weakens our own. We will transform American society into a socialist system that provides meaning, dignity, and hope for all its citizens, that cares and nurtures the most vulnerable among us, or we will become the victims of the Christian fascists we created. The Christian right is content to have the focus on societal or ethical as opposed to economic or social issues. The corporate media, whether they support or oppose the nomination of Amy Barrett to the Supreme Court, revolve around her opposition to abortion and membership in People of Praise, a far-right Catholic sect that practices speaking in tongues. What our corporate masters do not want examined is her subservience to corporate power, her hostility to workers, civil liberties, unions, and environmental regulations. The Democratic Party is beholden to the same donor class as the Republican Party. And since the media long ago substituted the culture wars for politics, the most ominous threat posed by Barrett and the Christian right is ignored. We currently have 5 Federalist Society Supreme Court justices. Barrett would be the 6th. And 2 of those justices, Clarence Thomas and Anton Scalia, were supported in the nomination process by Biden. All fascist and totalitarian movements paper over their squalid belief systems with the veneer of morality. They mouth pieties about restoring law and order, right and wrong, the sanctity of life, civic and family virtues, patriotism and tradition, to mask their dismantling of the open society and their silencing and persecution of all those who oppose them. This is the real game being played by the Christian fascists, which since the early 1970s has received tens of millions of dollars in corporate donations. The Christian right will mobilize in this election to use any tool, no matter how devious, from right-wing armed militias to the invalidation of ballots, to thuggish poll watchers in democratically leaning neighborhoods, to block Biden and the Democratic candidates from assuming office. The road to despotism is always paved with righteousness. Capitalism, driven by the twin obsessions of maximizing profit and reducing the cost of production by slashing workers' rights and wages, is antithetical to the Christian gospel, as well as the Enlightenment ethic defined by Immanuel Kant. But capitalism in the hands of the Christian fascists has become sacralized in the form of the prosperity gospel, the belief that Jesus came to minister to our material needs, blessing believers with wealth and power. The prosperity gospel delights the corporations that have carried out the slow motion corporate coup d'etat. And this is why large companies such as Tyson Foods, which places Christian right chaplains in its plants, Purdue, Walmart, Sam's Warehouse, along with many others, pour money into the movement and institutions such as Liberty University and Patrick Henry Law School. This is why corporations have given millions of dollars to the Judicial Crisis Network and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to campaign for Barrett's appointment to the court. Barrett has ruled to cheat gig workers out of overtime, greenlight fossil fuel extraction and pollution, gut Obamacare, and strip consumers of protection from corporate fraud. The watchdog group Accountable US found that as a circuit court judge, Barrett faced at least 55 cases in which citizens took on corporate entities in her court, and 76% of the time she ruled in favor of corporations. These corporations don't care about abortion, gun rights, or the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman. But like the German industrialists who backed the Nazi Party, they know that the Christian right will give an ideological veneer to ruthless corporate tyranny. These corporations view the Christian fascists the same way the German industrialists viewed the Nazis, as buffoons. They are aware that the Christian fascists will trash what is left of our anemic democracy and the ecosystem. But they also know that they will make huge profits in the process, and the rights of workers and citizens will be ruthlessly suppressed. If you are poor, if you lack proper medical care, if you are paid substandard wages, if you are trapped in the lower class, if you are a victim of violence, if you are in prison, this is because according to this ideology, you are not a good Christian and not blessed by God. In this belief system, you deserve what you get. There is nothing wrong, these homegrown fascists preach, with the structures or systems of power. The legal calculus for the Christian right no longer revolves around the concept of universal human rights, but around the tenets of quote unquote Bible-believing Christians who supposedly authored the Constitution. Huge segments of the population are stripped of moral worth and legal protection. This process is incremental and it is often unseen. As the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels understood, the best propaganda is that which, as it were, works invisibly, penetrates the whole of life without the public having any knowledge of the propagandistic initiative. These Christian fascists are adept at preying on the despair of tens of millions of Americans. They know how to exploit the moral and physical decay, as well as the despair it causes, to seduce their followers into calling for their own enslavement. Trump has greenlighted the Islamophobia of the Christian right, banning Muslim immigrants, rolling back civil rights regulation. He has made war on reproductive rights, as I mentioned. The tinder that could ignite violent conflagrations throughout the United States lies ominously stacked around us. Millions of disenfranchised white Americans who see no way out of their economic and social misery, struggling with an emotional void, are seething with rage against a corrupt ruling class and bankrupt liberal elite that presides over political stagnation and grotesque mounting social inequality. Millions more alienated young men and women, also locked out of the economy, with no realistic prospect for advancement or integration, gripped by the same emotional void, have harnessed their fury in the name of tearing down governing structures and anti-fascism. These enraged, increasingly polarized segments of the population are rapidly consolidating as the political center disintegrates. They stand poised to tear apart the United States, awash in military-grade weapons, unable to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout, cursed with militarized police forces that function as internal armies of occupation and de facto allies of the neo-fascists. We have three options left: reform, which given the decay in the American body politic is impossible; revolution; or tyranny. The more things deteriorate, the more the elites feel threatened, the more brutal the police, the National Guard, the organs of state security will become. The longer we defy our masters, the more the populations in the jails and prisons, which are already largest in the world, will swell. Militarized police empowered to use lethal force on unarmed citizens and carry out wholesale surveillance of the public, along with prisons, have become, as in all totalitarian states, our primary form of social control. If this mafia state is not overthrown, America will soon become a naked police state, where any opposition, however tepid, will be met with draconian censorship or force. Police in cities across the country have already thwarted the reporting by dozens of journalists covering the protests through physical force, arrest, tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray. The huge social divides, often built around race, will be used by the neo-fascists to divert a legitimate rage by a betrayed white working class to set neighbor against neighbor. Neo-fascist patriots will attack people of color, Muslims, feminists, intellectuals, artists, the media, and liberals. Dissent, even nonviolent dissent, will become treason. Violence employed by police and security agencies such as Homeland Security and the FBI, which have already devolved into occupying forces, will protect the exclusive interests of a tiny, ruling, criminal class. The uprising in the streets of American cities are not only about the wanton murder by police of yet another person of color, but a frantic fight to wrest back power over our own lives. They go far beyond police brutality, a daily reality for those trapped in our internal colonies. The uprisings are fueled as well by the seizure of the institutional and structural mechanisms that once made some form of equality, always imperfect, always colored by an animus towards the poor and people of color, possible. Most of America gets the message the oligarchs are sending. They and their children are expendable. They don't count. It is only the dwindling and largely white middle and professional class that still believes in the fiction that this election offers a choice or that we live in a democracy. It is ultimately the ruling elites who will determine the nature of resistance. When they close every escape route, when they speak exclusively in the language of force, then the language of force will become the only form of communication. The longer the ruling elites refuse to address the root causes behind these protests, behind the enemy that is gripping the United States, the more they loot the treasury to enrich themselves and their fellow oligarchs. The more they engage in futile and absurd efforts to deflect blame, the more unrest will spread. The poor, the vulnerable, those who are not white or not Christian, those who are undocumented or who do not mindlessly repeat the cant of a perverted Christian nationalism, will be offered up to feed the crisis cult, a familiar form of human sacrifice that plagues decayed societies. Once these enemies are purged from the nation, we are promised America will recover its lost glory, except that once one enemy is obliterated, another takes its place. Crisis cults require a steady escalation of conflict, a steady stream of victims. This is what made the war in the former Yugoslavia inevitable. Once one stage of conflict reaches a crescendo, it loses its efficacy. It must be replaced by ever more brutal and deadly confrontations. This intoxication and addiction to greater and greater levels of violence to purge the society of evil led to genocide in Germany and the former Yugoslavia. We are not immune. It is what Ernst Jünger called a feast of death. Thank you.